Okay, well, like all of the other speakers and panelists, it's really an honor and it's humbling to speak in front of such an august audience. And I think what really defines a committed scholarly and intellectual audience is staying until the bitter end. So thank you very much for that. I'm not sure if I should attribute the good attendance to the fact that we have such an intriguing set of panelists or to the fact that we're right before the reception. I don't know. In any case, so this is entitled Promoting, Launching, and Sustaining Innovation. Mostly that title came from the fact that we couldn't figure out how the heck to combine these three talks. But they do have in common the notion that they're really about the infrastructure and approaches for promoting the concept of innovation. I kind of think of it almost like metacognition, which is the notion of thinking about thinking. This is kind of thinking about innovation. So the way that we will do this is I will be starting off and talking about teaching innovative thinking, and then my colleagues John Sibley Butler and Stephen Speaks will follow, and I will introduce each of them as they come up to give their talks. And then following all of that, just like many of the other panels, we'll be taking questions. And again, I would ask that anyone who asks a question, please come up to the microphone. So, okay, I'm gonna actually skip that. So I was delighted to see that both Rex Tillerson and Ralph Templeton talked both about the tremendous import of supplying a pipeline of young people as the next generation of innovators, and actually specifically both of them talked about K through 12 education. This summer, Newsweek magazine highlighted a problem that they called the creativity crisis in our K through 12 education. And at the level that we're all at the kind of level of being committed to science, the Institute of Medicine, National Academy, actually it was the presidents of the National Academies of Science, promoted this publication, which was actually, it was two publications, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, and this one, which is the most recent, Rapidly Approaching Category 5. And in this assessment of where American science stands today, they were very, very concerned about America's competitiveness in the area of innovation, and pointed out something that, again, we've heard more than once today, which is that America really is losing its competitive edge in the sciences. So one of the things that I find very curious is that if it is the case, and I think we all believe it is, that innovation is the engine of science, how can it be that we don't teach our young people conceptually how to think more innovatively? There is, in fact, I would posit a method for innovative thinking. Now, I've asked many of my colleagues why this is so, and what they've told me is that their belief is that innovation cannot be taught, that in fact it's temperamental, it's characterological. But there is actually about a generation's worth of data that would suggest that this is not the case, that in fact innovation can be taught, creativity can be taught. And there have been, this has become a more mature, I wouldn't say it's a mature literature, but it's become a more mature literature. And there have been two meta-analyses published on these evaluation studies of innovative or creativity programs, one on 40 studies, another on 70. And what they've shown very consistently is 2 to 3-fold increases in the fluency, the novelty, and the originality of thinking amongst those students that have completed these programs. And that actually translates into improvements in problem solving, in attitudes, and in work performance amongst adults. Not only that, but in fact, these results are very robust. They're quite generalizable, and it's been shown that structured programs in teaching innovative thinking work independent of age, gender, intellectual capacity, professional and academic setting. So there really is a literature that suggests that this can be done. But again, it's not done in science education, and it's certainly not done in science higher education. I have polled scientists from all over the country, and I really cannot find any really fully established structured programs in this regard. So we've created one at UT, at the University of Texas School of Public Health and UT Health. And the conceptual components of this program are really threefold. First, we teach students how to recognize and find alternatives to the habitual cognitive patterns that we all use, and I'll explain that in a minute. We teach them tools that enhance their ability to generate new ideas, and then we align this notion of divergent thinking, i.e. idea generation, with the scientific method. So first of all, let's talk about these habitual cognitive patterns and their implications. So sociologists, psychologists, linguists call these frames. Frames really literally define the way that human beings think and communicate. They are the expectations which we use to interpret new incoming information, and from that information to draw inferences. So there really are our fundamental set of assumptions and expectations. In science, you might call these our scientific paradigms. I'll give you an example. When you go to a restaurant, you have the expectation that you're going to order, that you're going to be served politely, and that you're going to pay. Now, if you went to a restaurant and the waitress, upon your ordering, scowled at you and said, "Go to the kitchen and get it yourself," you would be very shocked, and you wouldn't really know how to continue that interaction. That is really interfering with your frame. In the classroom, we do a number of things to teach people really to identify their frames, of which they're extremely ubiquitous. I mean, we have them all the time. We have all sorts of frames, for instance, about what to expect when we come into this kind of a setting, about what we're supposed to be doing up here. And if we violated those frames, you would be shocked. But one example is we use these brain teasers like this one. Gary and Nancy are lying dead on the floor. Around them is a puddle of water and some broken glass. What are the circumstances of their death? And we use this to teach people that they instantly have a whole set of assumptions about what might be going on here. So when you think about this, your common set of assumptions is you immediately think, you know, about those shows on TV where you have the two people outlined in yellow lying dead on the floor. But in fact, a really better answer to this is that Gary and Nancy are fish, and their fish tank broke and they suffocated. Now, again, the issue is your frame was that Gary and Nancy are human by virtue of the fact that they have names. But in fact, Gary and Nancy obviously could be fish. All right. Another example of this, there are many examples of this in science. In fact, you might even say that almost all paradigm shifts are really breaks of frames. But Herb Needleman, who is a colleague and a good friend of mine from the University of Pittsburgh, really broke the frame around lead when in the early 1970s he was taking care of a young girl who was lead intoxicated. And when he treated her with chelating agents and then went to the mother and said, okay, well, your child is going to live and you're going to take her home, but you're going to have to make sure that she never eats lead chips again. And the mother said, that's impossible. Any house that I could afford would have peeling lead paint. He realized that this was not a problem as it had previously been framed, which was an individual clinical problem that was preventable, but in fact, it was a problem of ubiquitous population intoxication. So it really was a public health program. He shifted the frame from a clinical problem to a public health problem. Observation is very, very strongly affected by our frames. This is a tragic example of that. This is the case of Amadou Diallo. He was a Haitian immigrant who happened to be standing on a step at midnight in a bad part of the Bronx, just looking around. And an unmarked police car drove up and the police officers thought, why is this man just standing here at midnight looking around? Probably he's selling drugs. They came out and, to make a long story short, noted that he was reaching into his pocket and within seconds fired more than 24 bullets into his body. When they found him lying there in a pool of blood, they appreciated that in his outstretched hand was not the gun that they anticipated, but it was his wallet. He had been searching for his wallet because he thought that these big white guys were running at him to rob him. The point is that the expectations of the police officers was bad neighborhood, black guy, probably selling drugs. His expectation was a bunch of big white guys running at me, screaming something. I don't really understand their English. They're probably coming to rob me. And nobody really read the situation correctly because of their frames. But framing and limiting observation is ubiquitous in science as well. So a great example of this is Marshall and Warren's win of the Nobel Prize for the discovery of H. pylori and peptic ulcer. Warren discovered these H. pylori in gastric biopsy tissues using no special stains and no special microscopic equipment. And it actually turns out that a German team had previously seen this but hadn't reported it because the assumption was that these bugs could not be living in such a low pH environment. There could not possibly be bacteria in that environment, so that it could not be bacteria that was being seen. The final thing about frames that's really important in teaching innovative thinking is that they're highly emotional. And because they're highly emotional, we hold on to them very tightly. So if I were to say to you, I'm going to come to Austin, I'm going to go out into the streets of Austin tomorrow, and I'm going to remove all the street signs and street signals in the busiest intersections of the city, you would be shocked. I mean, you'd think, wow, this woman is absolutely out of her mind. You would not respond by thinking, that's a very interesting concept, let's think that through. It actually turns out that there are several European cities that are launching just this experiment. The notion is that by paying attention to street signs and signals, you're not paying attention to all of the information that's coming at you, whether it be the bicyclist that's crossing your path or the woman with a stroller or whatever it may be. So this is actually under investigation. Now let's talk about the tools that we use to enhance idea generation. Analogy is one that we've heard a lot about today. It's very commonly used in science. I'll just give you one of these two examples because I'm running out of time, but excellent example is Jenner, who noted that milkmaids didn't get smallpox typically, and thereby understood that analogously cowpox, which he figured was probably related to smallpox, might be used as a vaccine. In the classroom, we challenge our students with really unusual analogies to get them to think very differently. So one of these, for instance, is how is a marriage like a matchbox? My favorite answers to this that students have given are they can both light on fire. They both have 8 letters. Isn't that interesting? And my favorite one is they can both be picked up in a bar. Expansion is another tool that we teach. Here's an excellent example of expansion. Expansion means literally taking your scientific question and just blowing it up. And when you look at things, obviously, from different orders of magnitude, you get very different answers. You get very different patterns. So I would posit that the notion of evolution really came from the expansion of the question. Darwin was living in a world where everything was really related to kind of a religious ideology, a kind of religious context, and he broke out of that religious context and simply asked the broader fundamental question about how life came to be. Reversal is another very useful tool. Reversal can be done either by negating a question or by flipping the exposure and the outcome in a question. So one of my favorite ones is medicine is the presence of disease, public health is the absence of disease. Public health is very difficult for people to understand because of what I call obliviousness to absence. It's hard to get people excited about the absence of something. It's hard to get them to comply with something that's not going to happen to them. So good example of reversal. Poe is a tool that comes from the kind of grandfather of this field called Edward de Bono. And Poes are counterfactuals. They're notions that on the face of them seem crazy. And what we try to get students to do is to prove that they make sense. Again, just really kind of flipping their thinking. So Poe, one example of Poe is cups made of ice. So you immediately think, okay, that would work really, really well in Austin in the summer. But the fact of the matter is that it might work really well in Vermont in the winter because cups made of ice would be very inexpensive to manufacture, and there would be no trash, no waste. We do a lot of work in groups, so we teach brainstorming. I'm actually not going to go through this great example from DARPA because I only have 1 minute left, but there are lots and lots of examples of the use of social networking and social groups and how powerful they can be in solving problems. But in science, we virtually never use, I've never seen used kind of a traditional brainstorm whereby you just throw every idea up there without any judgment whatsoever. A good brainstorm will generate more than 100 ideas an hour. When I said that to my students, they gasped and they kind of said, gosh, what kind of group would that be that could generate 100 ideas an hour? And an hour later, they were on idea 130 and going fast. So divergent thinking first, convergent thinking comes next in a brainstorm. And then finally, harmonization. So we bring this all back into the scientific method. We define the problem, gather information, separate the raw inputs from the frames, which is very important, generate alternative original ideas, converge into a single set of insights or hypotheses, best hypotheses, and then put those into action. Just the last thing is I want to share with you just one example of a final project that came out of this class. These students were trying to understand the best way to involve people in the process of increasing advance directives. So those are your living wills. And it's a real problem in the United States that most of us don't have these, and in part it's responsible for the huge increase in cost at the end of life. So what they realized was that the frame that they went to families and practitioners and they actually spoke to them directly as well as going to literature, and they realized that the frame was that death is very scary, sober, mysterious. It's approached with awe and fear, and so families don't want to talk about it. So they said, let's flip the frame. Let's talk about death and taxes. And so they came up with this, what looks like a tax form, but it actually is called the U.S. Individual Advance Directive Claim. And you check off the boxes, and the idea in putting it into action would be that every year when you submit your tax form, you submit the U.S. Individual Advance Directive Claim. And you basically let the government know and let your practitioners know exactly how you feel about your advance directives. So in summary, innovative thinking can be taught. It is the key to thinking in a very different kind of way. These students can dramatically improve their ability to generate ideas and to think very differently through the variety of techniques that I've just talked about and a number of others.